Hello there, everyone. Welcome to Fired Up. My name is Morgan McLintic, and today I am joined by Ian Lipner
Hello.
and Chris Ulbrich.
Hi there.
Today we're going to be talking about how to become a thought leader. This is the second in our two-part series. The first was around what it takes to be a thought leader and why you might want to do that. And just to sort of recap, it's because it will help with your sales, it will help reduce churn. So it's a very important part of a comms program. But how do you actually go about doing that? So we thought we'd just walk through the different stages today so that we can actually know how to implement a thought leadership program. And top of the show then, Ian, how do we select who should be the thought leader in our organization?
Finding the right voices for your brand is something that sometimes seems very obvious, especially if it's a small organization and founder mode. But sometimes you need more folks to be involved, and it might not be quite as apparent. So you have to kind of take a broader approach than just who's got the title to figure out who's going to be your best thought leaders. They're often folks that are the people that are deeply involved in the creation of the product, the creation of the partnerships within the industry that are important. And so it could be an engineer, it could be a product designer, or it could even be somebody who's on the front lines of customer success. Generally, what you want to figure out is who's driving innovation internally. Do they have the bandwidth to help with the effort? Who's shaping industry conversations? The folks that are going to all those different conferences, they might be going beyond just meet and greet or standing at the booth. They might be serving on standards committees or participating in policy discussions. So they might be the folks that are really well connected to understand sort of what the current landscape looks like. And then oftentimes the people who are already creating content that is more technical can be great at helping to contribute to the larger PR effort. In general, what you're trying to do is make sure that your audience and your experts match up. For example, if you are helping a company that's selling HR software, your CHRO becomes more important than they might normally be to your program, right? And likewise, some of the more obvious things around security, you want the people who actually have the most credibility there. And when you're talking about compliance or regulations, it might be a legal team or somebody from risk management. And these are all alternatives to the standard, founder, CEO, that kind of leader. Those folks are, if you can get their time, they usually have a lot of these insights embedded in their thought leadership as well. They're more likely to be putting them in perspective of how to build an organization properly, how to run teams, how to prepare for changes in the market, than focusing on how to create the best instance of a NVIDIA implementation or something like that.
I would add there are also practical considerations to bear in mind when thinking about who you want to put on point in your thought leadership program. So many thought leadership programs get bogged down in the content production pipelines. Often at the one bottleneck is the ideation phase, another bottleneck is the approvals phase. So it is smart early on to think not just who has good ideas, who would be an ideal thought leader if you could just get them to, as you said, Ian, if you could just get their time. Well, if you can't get their time and you just know as an insider, and here I'm speaking to people who work within organizations, marketing leads, who have some insight into the organization, if you know realistically the person you have in mind is not interested in doing this kind of program, they're really focused on nothing but hitting their KPIs. They have no interest in doing this project to build their brand or build the company's brand. It's just not important to them. Then that's a sign that even though they might look good on paper as a candidate for the campaign, when you get down to brass tacks, when you get down to the actual active content production, you're going to find yourself frustrated and the whole program's going to bog down. So better then to look beyond at some of the other alternatives you put out there.
Right. Some people are naturally, they have the personality and the sort of risk tolerance to want to do this. And others are maybe more introverted and they just don't want to put themselves out there, even if they know the stuff and are the most credible in your organization. It's just not what they want to do. And it'll never, therefore, become a priority. And when the document is ready to publish, say it's a byline, they'll never feel comfortable about doing it. And so the campaign will get bogged down. So we've got our thought leader. It might be someone in the labs team. It might be it's not the obvious candidates often. Now, how do we determine, Chris, what it is that we're going to be a thought leader about?
I think that's a question that you can even ask while you are searching for your thought leader, because if you are hoping to create a thought leadership campaign where the thoughts are relayed by third parties, whether that be, it could be on social, but more often you're thinking about placing guest posts or guest articles on third party editorial sites, maybe on Forbes, maybe in trade publications, whatever this thought leader has to say has to be appealing to the audience where you want to place their thoughts and where you're hoping those thoughts will be amplified. The most ready and amiable and easy to work with thought leader in your organization is not going to be effective unless that thought leader can get behind thoughts that the media market wants to amplify. So this is a concept that we call message media fit, which is sort of the marketing equivalent of product market fit. And it's just the idea that whatever messages, whatever stories you're trying to put out in the world, if there's a third party editorial component to your campaign, you need to think about whether there's a press basically out there that is ready to receive what you're selling. Basically, is there someone out there buying what you're selling? And you can have a great idea, but if there's no media in place for whatever reason to relay it, then it's not really an effective idea. It'll fall on deaf ears. It's a tree falling in the forest. So that's important to think about when you're selecting a thought leader. But then once you have a thought leader in mind, and when you're going through the ideation phase and you're brainstorming, you want to think about not only what's interesting to what kinds of topics will be interesting to your customers, but what kind of topics are timely and relevant to the media organizations you're hoping to pick up your stories.
Yeah, I think this is a good point to also remind about just how important finding the media and that are set up to write thought leadership pieces are, right? I've definitely had discussions where it's sort of thrown in there we're adding some topping on at the end, right? Okay, well, we're doing this product release, so this is a great opportunity to get my executive out there to do some thought leadership. That's not usually the best time to do thought leadership, right? Thought leadership is about, hey, what are other people thinking in this marketplace? And what do you agree? Do you disagree? What are the trends? What does the future look like? Not what do you do and why is your product a fit for the market, right? And there's just not a lot of thought leadership you can do at all there unless maybe you're an engineer talking about the inside of that product. The main time to be considering how thought leadership can help your program are between the milestones that you're setting up and creating forcing events on your calendar. So I know that might seem elementary to some of our listeners, but I think for some of the executives that they're going to be pitching this, the expectations need to be set right, that this is very much a marketplace of ideas kind of thing. And you have to win in that marketplace. It's not simply the bona fides of the executive. It's how relevant, how helpful that thought leadership is for the journalists.
It's a sort of truism among PR professionals that to do thought leadership, you need to have leading thoughts, right? It's almost everyone who works in the business recognizes that idea, whether they say it in those exact same words. And to be clear, it often does take a village to come up with a thought leadership campaign. In a perfect world, the marketing and PR people are just facilitating the brilliance of some thought leader who has a steady flow of leading ideas. But that kind of person probably is already generating thought leadership of their own. And you're, as a PR pro, you're probably just steering and helping amplify what they're already doing. But more often, it's a joint effort to sort of help develop the latent potential of a thought leader within the company who does have great ideas, but they might not be perfectly attuned to the media environment. That's where the PR team can help shape the story to something that's a little more timely. And between the two of you, or the group of you, you can come up with it. But it's all to say that we wouldn't want to give the impression that this is all on it's just a matter of finding the right thought leader and sort of winding them up and letting them go. It is a process.
Yeah, totally. And I also think we shouldn't ignore, and when we're thinking about what is it that we know of value, the data that the company has, right, Ian? Often that can be a source of inspiration and content for a thought leadership campaign.
Yeah, absolutely. It's what do you know that others don't? And we talk about this a lot, but your data might arise from your platform. Your data might arise from you explicitly asking people questions that folks want the answer to. And it also can be based on, you can bring forward experiences and things that are happening often in the customer base to go, hey, we're seeing that a lot more people are asking for X now. And you're not saying 74% more often, but you can kind of say, hey, there's an additional piece of evidence besides sort of what you're hearing, journalist. I am indeed being asked about that feature or that capability. That can help round out your point of view. I think that the problem that some folks have with their thought leadership is the idea that they've got these ideas and that those ideas should be sent out there and marketed, rather than that they should be interacting with what other people are putting forward and saying. And I feel that the PR firm often plays an important role in this because, like, folks who are super busy have their heads down and they know what they're seeing in their customer base and in their product and all that, but they might not know about another trend or another way people are talking about things. And you can bring that to them, and often they'll go, huh, that's interesting. Here's why that's wrong. Or that's interesting. Let me come back to you because I can see how this might apply to this other area. I remember going through these conversations when Gen AI came on the scene. Not everybody's product had it, but it did have an impact on how the media were talking about things, and sort of having a take on whatever your industry was important. And some folks simply hadn't tried this stuff yet. So because we're sort of news junkies, we often bring the headlines to them that can get their noodle going.
I think that's important. You've definitely got to workshop the idea and expose thought leaders to other opinions out there to get their reactions, and so that they can sharpen their own take, because you don't want to go over the top with a message that's exactly the same as everyone else or that people have already debunked. So we've thought about we found our thought leader. We've got, okay, this is the platform. This is our take. We've got some data. Chris, I want to establish the credibility of my thought leader before we go out there so that they've got their bona fides. How do I go about that?
So this is where the more full spectrum aspect of the campaign comes in. And it might actually make sense at this point to step back and review what can be involved in a thought leadership campaign. We've been talking about it, and I think most people, when they hear thought leadership, they immediately think guest posts, right? They think byline, what we call byline articles, right? An 800-word, either a blog post or an article for a publication like Forbes, Newsstack, that expresses a point of view in long form. But thought leadership can take many forms. It can take the form of LinkedIn posts. So organic social is, I think, actually an increasingly important part of a thought leadership program. It feels like post-pandemic, LinkedIn has really taken off as a preferred channel for brand awareness and, of course, for personal brand promotion. Thought leadership campaign really can merge the two. But also not to be overlooked is the importance of opportunistically getting a thought leader's thoughts in the news. And that in some ways can be an even more powerful, if you're looking to establish the credibility of a spokesperson as an industry commentator, a regular cadence of appearances in the trade press that your customers read, or even in national business media, if you're really hitting on all cylinders, that can be at least as impactful for your overall brand awareness and for your overall brand credibility than bylines, especially if they're in trade publications or a blog, right, which might have relatively low readership. So you can get a lot of bang for your buck out of commentary. And that requires, though, a separate consideration, a separate sort of work stream, because when reporters are looking for comment, they tend to need it on a relatively short time basis. So the kind of workflow you've set up for producing articles isn't necessarily relevant to the workflow you need for what we sometimes refer to as rapid response, which is pitching commentary on. Originally, it was pitching commentary on breaking news. And over time, I think that term has been extended to responding to calls for sources, which can, typically when reporters will actually post a call for sources on various services that are monitored by PR pros, they'll typically want a response within 1 to 3 days. Occasionally they work farther out in weeks, but if you aren't getting your comment in early, you're probably not getting picked. Even if technically you have 2 weeks to get your thoughts in, usually it's the first come, first served. That is to say that the most successful thought leadership campaigns have an earned media component, an editorial media component, a rapid response component, in addition to the long form component.
Yeah, I think that's important because literally this person is there explaining the news that's happening as the reader discovers it, right? There's a cybersecurity attack, and then here is this expert explaining what has happened and why it happened and what you need to do to protect yourself. And you think, wow, this person is right on the edge of the news and is certainly a thought leader because the readers are understanding it through their experience. And so I think it's vital.
Yeah, and I think that kind of coverage delivers the highest value in terms of third-party validation. If you think, what is the point of a media program? A big part of it is communicating that what you're selling, someone else, some authority thought was worth covering. If that thing that you're selling is an idea, then if you are the one expert quoted in an article, that means that a publication that is trusted by your audience had any number of authorities they could have gone to, but they chose to quote you as the authority on a particular topic. That carries a lot of weight.
If you're not the only and the company is good, if you're a startup and then you've got infrastructure giants quoted next to you, right? Like that looks fantastic for raising your profile. I think it's also worth noting like what a good batting average looks like here, because it's tough. It's not an MLB batting average. In the majors, if you get on a third of the time, you're an all-time great. If you do it 1 out of 4 times, like you're going to struggle to be in the league, right? Here we're looking, what would you say? 1 out of 8, 1 out of 10 is a good rate, depending on how expert and certainly for the beginning of the program.
That's right. That's right. Your hit rate, so this is the thing, that at the beginning of the program, hit rate tends to be very low because the reporters don't know you're expert. You're building your credibility with them. And part of that is just showing up. And there are many ways to show up. I think we'll be talking about some others a little later on in this episode. But at the beginning, if you are not a known quantity, the whole point of quoting you is because you're regarded as a trusted authority with something interesting to say. You can show up with something interesting to say, but there's a lot of competition, basically. I think that number is right. But I think you can, honestly, over time, work your way up to that all-star batting average once you have established relationships with reporters who are coming to rely on you for comment on certain topics. I have definitely worked on campaigns where the hit rate for contributed content was 1 out of 3 or even slightly better. As you say, it's important to realize it's a numbers game at the beginning. And that where I talked about a separate workflow and separate arrangements for this kind of program or this aspect of the program than for contributed content. That's partly what I mean. There's some expectation setting that needs to happen at the beginning of the program. And part of that expectation setting is the understanding that at the beginning, we're going to need the PR people will draft suggested comment, typically it requires sign off from the SME who's being quoted. And not only will that SME need to be available to look at it, review it, rejigger it if necessary. Ideally, it's not necessary, depending on the SME. Sometimes it is, or depending on at the beginning of the program, there's usually less alignment between the PR team and the SME. So there's often sort of crossed wires. So that's a process. It takes time. And sometimes the thought leaders get disillusioned early on because they feel like they're spending 20 minutes reviewing a quote and then they send it over. And in the worst case, they simply expect it to run because it hasn't been communicated to them that just because we're submitting this, this is just a swing we're taking. It doesn't mean we've connected. But even if they understand that it's a swing and hopefully a hit, if you miss 1, 2, 3 times, then there's a decent chance if expectations aren't aligned that they bail out of the program entirely. And then that's not ideal. That's why it's so important to pick the right candidate early on. And the person who is perfect for the writing program might not be ideal for the rapid response program. So all the more reason to cast your net widely.
It's going to take some practice. And as you get better ROI, your comments are better, you do it faster, your name recognition is higher. But a lot of people, they just give up after, as Ian might have said, say it takes 10 times to connect. You give up at 9, you're giving it up as a bust. But in a practical sense, your thought leader needs a good bio. So their LinkedIn bio needs to be fully built out. You need a great bio for their blog post, right? There is evidence to suggest that, maybe you're publishing stuff on your blog that with a great bio, that's great for SEO. And increasingly, it's really good for AI search as well. So if you want to be seen as a thought leader and your content needs to appear there, having a really fleshed out bio on your website for the authors is really important too. There are places like we just talked about, these sort of marketplaces for looking for sources. You can often build a whole profile there. Quoted is one of these. You can build a profile and links to prior speaking ops and prior articles they've been in, so that if a reporter comes cold and says, hey, I've never heard of this person, they can instantly see, oh, look, other publications have quoted, so I'm in good company using this person. And so keeping those up to date. So there are some very practical things that just need to happen for each of your thought leaders in your program. And often you'll have a number of them. And so there's some foundational work that needs to happen here. And then we need to decide, okay, what is our POV here, Ian? And how do I go about, we've touched on it a little bit, but in a practical sense, how do we go about building what the sort of POV should be for the thought leadership?
Some of this depends on the stuff we've talked about already. Like, what do you got? What are you working with? I remember one executive who just seemed to have this natural ability to come up with what we like to call sparklers, like turns of phrases that like magically just encapsulate a difficult topic. And those folks usually understand sort of innately, where's the headline here? How to be unique in their point of view. And I think that's the top priority, is having a differentiated point of view that is compelling. And compelling can mean, oh, that makes a lot of practical sense. That's a logically sound argument. But it can also be part of the passion that the person portrays in the way that they say their point of view and the way they state their point of view. Oftentimes, journalists they're going to get very similar responses if they have a query out there, right? There's been this huge cybersecurity incident, right? They're going to get 250 responses that basically say, this is a really important thing that we should all pay attention to. And there's lots of different ways you can mitigate it, right? But the response they're most likely to use is the one where somebody's outraged, where somebody is surprised, or they are putting forward a theory, an accusation, something risky, which generally executives don't love. And the more people that are involved in putting together your point of view, the less of a point of view it will become. It will just become this watered down sort of view. So I would put forward that you find that thought leader and you pull them aside and you rev them up as much as you can on that topic and try to get them to say the thing that is most compelling. And there's going to be a review process, right? There's someone else is going to back that down a little bit if it's too crazy. But you can at least start with something that is not generic, that is quotable, that stands out from the others. I think it's more important that the quote stands out than that their resume stands out in most cases.
I think that's really important. One of the best calling cards you can come up with for a thought leader, if you're trying to advertise their ideas, is sample quotes on the subject, especially if you're coming in cold. It's difficult to make the case that, with given all the competition, that you're saying something worth listening to. If A, it sounds like the assumption is it sounds like what everyone else has already said, and B, that they have no idea what this person is going to say. They're not going to take the chance. Another thing that you said, that it occurs to me that you can see the impact of social media on expectations for thought leadership. I mean, if you look at how posts on LinkedIn have changed over the last several years, it's certainly now table stakes, but it's almost a cliche where the poster who's really trying to generate engagement will come up with a paragraph that is really provocative above the read more link, right? They'll say, if you were like me, you always thought that the sky was blue. But I'm here to tell you, everybody out there is wrong. The sky is actually green. And here's how I found out, read more. Now, obviously, that's an absurd example. That's an exaggerated example. But I think that the expectation for flash and wow factor for thought leadership has grown because of the popularity of social media, which rewards that kind of intensity. So what I just described, say on LinkedIn, is the equivalent of the screaming headline that used to convince someone to put their quarter into a newspaper kiosk, flip the lid on the kiosk and pull out that newspaper, right? The headline wasn't maybe a perfect distillation of the story, but it was an ad for the story. And so I think it helps to think, like, how bold can you be? Because a sedate, measured tone and ideas that are really mainstream have less and less purchase these days.
Here's where I would actually say this is why I'm in PR for startups and challenger brands, right? Like, the media, they're supposed to tell us what the status quo is, and they're supposed to be interested in when it changes. And our clients, at least, are all intended to change the status quo. So tell us, what's wrong with the status quo that it needs this change? What's the flaws with it? Why is it out of date? Show us the why of your company, why you exist, by expressing what needs to change in the industry, what's bad, or when there's something that's happening that's new and good, get behind it, right? For me, the whole point of participating in the media conversation is to exact change in the future. Otherwise, I'd be working for the biggest brands that don't want anything to change because they're already winning. So if you really want to be a thought leader for a disruptive company, say something disruptive, please.
That's good. And so ask yourself the question, what wrong needs to be righted? What behaviors need to change? What dangers are out there? What actions do people need to take that they're not taking? What misinformation is there that they should be aware of? If you ask yourself those questions, that's going to sort of narrow down on what our point of view should be. We've got our expert. We've built out their sort of credibility. We've got our angle. Now we're going to execute. We're going to create the content. We're going to do thought leadership. We've touched on a few things, like media outreach is part of it. What are the other tactics, Chris?
The classic mode of executing on a thought leadership campaign is a hub and spoke model, where you create a piece of persistent content that is generative of multiple messages and ideas, and it can throw off bylines, it can throw off quotes, commentary. So often this is a data report. For startups, that is one of the most straightforward ways to insert yourself into a conversation because you are providing material, you're providing information that the world didn't have before. And almost by definition, it provides you some credibility as an expert. Because, as Ian said earlier, what do you know that nobody else knows? You've just generated new knowledge if you've crafted your data report well. And so in the middle, let's just say for the sake of argument, you've created a data report on a subject that is relevant to your customers and to reporters in your industry. Well, at that point, and I don't want to doing that is a whole process in itself. And I'll defer to Morgan and Ian to sort of lay out exactly what might be involved there. But once you have it, then if it's been thought through, you can start to build a plan around essentially monetizing it in message terms, squeezing it for all the value it can generate in all the different channels you're trying to reach.
So let's just talk about tactically what might we do. We've got our sort of central sort of repository, and then what am I going to do? Am I going to do videos? We're doing blog posts. What do the tactics look like in a thought leadership program?
You started in on that. I think it's basically what is the best form of content for sort of each of the places you reach your audience. So we could take that research report example, right? That, first of all, there might be a fulsome report that really gets into the detail. Then there might be some industry-focused insights that are smaller in format and are aimed at pitching or getting byline articles into industry publications. There might be a infographic on your website or an engaging web landing page that takes people through that data and contextualizes it for the person who's most likely to implement the technology or the product that it focuses on. There might be social cards and different formats that you can use to get out individual data points or a couple quotes that highlight those data points. This stuff could be a great part of someone's presentations inside of a speech in a keynote, or if they're giving a TED style type talk. You could be on a podcast and talk about it. You could be on our podcast and talk about it. You will find that as you create a bunch of these assets, that they form a sort of a library that you have of your insights. And you might be able to we've had clients put it into a book and create a whole book about it. So as you look at, all right, what is the raw material that I have here? You can think about that, all those different spokes, to Chris's earlier reference to that hub and spoke model, and all the places that it can go. We've even had a client that we took the results, we found some personas that we identified among their key target market, and we built those out for them to create entire characters. And they ended up making trade show giveaways with stickers and things like that lined up with those personas. So you can really take it out to the nth degree. It's just a question of what's going to resonate with the folks that matter to you the most. For some folks, like a note in the GitHub repository might be the best thing that you can do, right? So it's really about demonstrating you understand where your audiences are getting their information, the formats that they prefer it in, and making it easy for them to consume that. Not everybody wants to read a whole PDF or a press release. Some people would rather just see something pop up in their social feed. Reach them where they are already.
Right. I like the framework there of thinking about, hey, I've got my thought leadership point of view. I'm going to get it across in different formats. Some of it's going to be video. Some of it's going to be on YouTube or a webinar I'm going to do. Some of it's going to be in person at events or speaker stuff. Some of it's going to be audio because that's how my audience gets it. And so I'm going to go on a bunch of podcasts. Some of it's going to be social because it's going to be small, and maybe it's going to be visual and an infographic or just like a little carousel. Some of it's going to be long form, the book. And so, that's going to take a bit of a lift to get up to that. But, you think about a book that can trigger then a whole sort of tour and media in itself And I want to go on to like, okay, we've got this thing, this platform, but then you need to sort of get people to take action and do something, which, okay, yeah, it could be buy your product, but it could be come to a conference, or it could be to change the way people buy. And I just, on the book example, I think about Professor Jonathan Haidt's recent book about the anxious generation, all about how teenagers and their use of social media. His book has created a ton of media that he got, but then has created laws like in Australia where they're literally banning it. And in fact, in my son's own school here in America, they're putting their phones into those little pockets as they go into each class, because of the book that one person wrote and promoted. So there, the thought leadership is driving action. And so for you as a startup, maybe not trying to change regulation around the world, but maybe it is that, hey, come to our conference. HubSpot got people to come to Inbound and then meet other people who are like-minded, who think like us, and learn from them. That could be a great action to take. So you've got to drive people to take action. But look, just as we wrap up here, I want to touch on a couple of mistakes that people can make with thought leadership. And one you touched on a little bit earlier, Chris, about sort of conflating product messaging with thought leadership messaging. So just unpack that a little bit more.
That's right. It's perfectly understandable, but probably the most common mistake, or I don't know, the most a common pitfall for programs like this is when the marketing team or the SME has a hard time disentangling their like media facing message, their thought leadership message from their product message. And again, I say that's totally understandable, because if you're at a startup, you're coming in every day, living and dying to sell it, to make and sell your product. You're obsessed with your product. You're obsessed with the question of how to make more people buy what you're selling product wise. But as we've seen over the course of this conversation, the kind of message that will make someone buy a product is not necessarily what will make them read an article or engage with you on the level of ideas. And so that's where I think a third party perspective can be so helpful, because when you are so immersed in the day to day of running a startup, it is difficult, because everyone you encounter, like when you encounter people outside your own business, it's in a buying or a potential buying context. When you're within your company, everyone's thinking about the product and how to make people buy the product. So you're not really necessarily running into a lot of people who aren't thinking about your product one way or another. And so having that third party perspective, and I think a lot of the times agencies like ours are brought in by marketers who realize that's an issue. And even they say, I can't even see beyond the horizon here. Or maybe there's another version of it where they say, I can see beyond the horizon, but because I'm so close to the team and because I'm so close, like they need to hear it from someone who has an independent perspective. So they'll bring in the consultant team to provide that sort of objective view. And that is actually, in a lot of cases, the first necessary step to executing a successful thought leadership campaign.
Yeah, I would say that oftentimes you'll have folks who are really focused on language. Maybe they develop the messaging for the company. They want to play sort of a word bingo game in every quote, right? Like, make sure you say this phrase that is unique to us, and it feels inauthentic. It doesn't align with what the reporter and the journalists are looking for in terms of frankness. And you can really hamper your ability to get success by making your thought leader bring all of his language in line with some piece of paper from your marketing team. I've certainly talked at length about not being boring and about, having a differentiated point of view. I think there's some other things that happen that are more sort of tactical, and that could be your thought leader's like, yeah, I'm ready to talk about that. You're approved to go out and find me opportunities for that. And then you bring them back to them and they say, oh, that one's a little bit too, they scare off by something that might be very visible, right? I don't know if I want to talk about that big brand that is messed up or those kinds of things. So you think, okay, this is a perfect opportunity for our point of view, but we're gonna shy away here because we got cold feet at the last minute. I think that can happen. And I think the mistake that folks make is to try to say too much, right? Like a long quote, 3 paragraphs, right? We'll often get as a first draft from folks, right? And sometimes if it's a complicated thing and it's necessary, that's fine. But often it seems they're trying to touch every base. And in doing so, there's no part of it that's quotable. Most programs, it requires some reps at the beginning to get the rhythm down. But then the good PR teams start to understand what works, what doesn't, what language is you can put on a page that's going to get approved the fastest. But ultimately, when you're at full speed and the thought leader trusts your agency team and you're working one-on-one, that's when I think we get the most results, is like a one-on-one, quick, fast, to the point, distinctive point of view. That's where we get the best benefit.
Well, that feels like a great place to wrap up this conversation. Ian, Chris, thanks so much for taking the time to walk us through it. If you want to learn more about that, we have a 2-part blog post about it, as well as some further information about data storytelling that we also referenced in this episode. So thank you for your time. I hope you found that useful. Please join us again next week for more startup marketing advice.